Okay, that's fine. Yes, you can sit there like this. All right. Well, before we actually start class today, I have some congratulations in order. We had 4 people in this class published in magnum opus. So please stand up when I say your name. Micah, Matthew, Grace, and Jorge. Let's give them a hand. Good job. Okay. I'm so proud of you. But I'm proud of all of you because the papers were really good, as I said before. And I'm sure they had a very hard time deciding which papers are going to be published. So I don't want anybody to get discouraged if you submitted papers and they didn't get picked this time, because you never know what a publisher is actually looking for. I found out that there's a theme for that print magazine that's coming out. Did any of you all submit papers for the print version back in the fall? I don't think we had done anything then that could be submitted. People in my level 2 and level 3 class did because they had finished some big papers. But it turns out there's a theme called Let Freedom Ring, and it has this red, white, and blue cover on the front and all. So I don't know if all the papers published in that print magazine are going to be related to the theme, but we didn't know about the theme as far as I know at the time. And I have no idea whether any of my students submitted papers that fit that theme, or whether they're sticking strictly to that theme, but they'll include other themes. I don't know. So I'm just waiting like everybody else to find out if anybody got in the magazine. The writing that we're going to start today is going to be a type of writing that we can turn in papers for in April, and that's book reviews, please. The most important thing to remember about writing about stories is it's different than writing a story. When you write about stories, you have to go about it in a different way. And this is really important to learn. I like the story writing part because it teaches you the parts of the story. But the kind of writing that we're going to start talking about today is the kind of writing that you will be doing mostly in high school and college classes. And so it's really important that you fully grasp the structure of a story. So let's just run through what we know about stories so far, because this will be very important with what we're doing today. Okay, there are 5 elements of literature. Who can tell me 5 parts of the story? Who can tell me what those are?
The introduction.
Well, there is an introduction, but that's not one of the 5 parts, but there is an introduction. Conflict is one of them. That's part of what we call the, what is that thing? That's, the conflict is the problem, that's right. But the climax and the conflict, both are actually part of this, what is that thing that we call that's arc-shaped?
Story chart.
Story chart? The plot, right. Remember, it's sort of like a rocket. Who in here likes physics? Nobody? Well, you know, if you fire off some kind of a projectile, it will go up in the air, and at some point it'll start losing altitude, and it comes down in kind of a arc shape, right? So the plot is not always, but in general, we think of the plot as kind of an arc shape. It might be like this, or it might be like this, but in general, it's an arc shape. Okay, so we've got the conflict, we've got the plot. What else?
The setting.
Yes. Who said that? Good. What else? Characters. One more thing. It sort of supports the whole story. Ta-da! The theme. what makes a story, the whole concept of story structure confusing? One of the things that makes it confusing, besides the fact that it's completely abstract, in other words, it's not something you can really put your hand on, it's just something in your mind, that makes it confusing. It's not like math where you can manipulate numbers on the page and stuff like that. What makes it confusing is that some of those elements of literature that we were just talking about are also part of one of the elements of literature, which is called plot. That's where people start getting confused. So there are 5 elements of literature that we just named: character, setting, conflict, plot, theme. And then there are 5 stages to the plot. And Matthew mentioned one of them. He called it an introduction. That's not exactly what we call it, but that's really what it is. What do we call that beginning part of the story structure?
Exposition.
Yes. And that's the first oval that you see. That's plot stage 1. And remember what I said? That's like going to a movie and see, or a play, and the curtains come back and you see who's in the play and you see where the play happens. That's the exposition. So in Romeo and Juliet, as we found out last time, the setting is, who remembers what the setting was? Did I hear you?
Yeah,
Okay. City in Italy. Does anybody remember the name of it? Starts with a V.
Venice.
That's a good guess.
For like,
Ta-da! Yes, Verona. And of course it opens with a fight scene. There's a big fight between, we find out about the Montagues and the Capulets, right? So that's the exposition of Romeo and Juliet. Before we find out and then we find out Romeo's in love with somebody that doesn't love him back. That's all part of the exposition. That's all getting us ready for the real problem that shows up in plot stage 2. And the problem, the conflict that we're introduced to in Romeo and Juliet is
that the girl he's in love with family hate, the family.
yes, problems with the family. The old-timey plot, isn't it? That's been played out over and over again, and they're telling how many stories. Great. And so because of that, we have our rising action. People start saying things and thinking things and doing things because they want to solve the problem of being together. And that goes on and on and on. Romeo and Juliet get married, and then Romeo kills Juliet's cousin, and then Romeo is banished, and then Juliet goes to the priest to get a, potion so that she'll go to sleep. And then Romeo is supposed to come and rescue her. All that's part of the rising action. And then we get to the climax. Where's the climax? That's plot stage 3. What's the climax of the story? Right. Right before Romeo takes that potion, right? We're up until then, we think maybe she'll wake up, or maybe Romeo won't be so hasty. But he's hasty, and he drinks the potion and he dies. So at that point, we know that the problem has been settled. They're not going to be able to be together, at least not alive. And then everything after that, the denouement, Juliet kills herself too, and then the priest runs away, but they find him and bring him back, and then he explains to them everything that happened, and they're really distressed. And in the conclusion, the families give up their feud, which I'm not sure how realistic that is. In real life, they would probably go on blaming each other.
Probably get worse.
Right. So that's how Romeo and Juliet falls into this plot structure. All right, now if we wanted to write about Romeo and Juliet as a story, we wanted to write about the actual story, we would go about it differently than actually writing the story. Did anybody, by any chance, use Romeo and Juliet as their story that they wanted to rewrite? I'm just curious. Okay, because sometimes people have done that. Did y'all read the example in the handbook? Okay. Writing a story is different from writing about a story. There's certain things that we want to do when we write about a story. So let's look at some of those things. Turn to page 43 in your handbook. Now, when we talk about conventions of something, that means the way everybody always does it. So when we write about a story, we're calling that literary analysis. And when we say conventions of literary analysis, we're talking about the way everybody is expected to know how to write about a story. Just like if you were to turn in a biology paper. Has anybody in here taken biology? Okay, have you had to turn in a paper for biology? Well, I have a book somewhere up on one of these shelves about how to write biology papers. There's a certain way to go about writing a science paper that is different than writing a literature paper, and we would call those conventions. So when we write literary analysis, there are conventions that we have to observe, and you might think of those as rules. And if you go to high school or college, and you already know how to do this very well, your instructor/professor will be very tender-hearted toward you and be kindly disposed toward you for not having to write a whole bunch of stuff on your paper telling you that you did it wrong, which takes up a lot of time. So let's talk about these. The first thing that's really different when we write about literature is that we write in present tense as though the story is happening right then. So if I were to write about Romeo and Juliet, I would not say, Romeo was in love with Rosalind. Then he met Juliet. That's past tense. If I were writing about the story, I would say, let's see, who can do it for us? Who knows what I'm talking about? I know somebody knows what I'm talking about. Here's the past tense sentence. Romeo was in love with Rosalind. How do you say that in present tense?
Romeo is in love.
Yes. Romeo is in love with Rosalind. And here's the next sentence. Then he met Juliet.
He meets Juliet.
Yes, exactly. Right. So when we write about literature, we write it in present tense as though the story is happening right that minute. That's kind of weird, isn't it? And yet, that's the way it must be done. Okay? When you're talking about the author, though, in the paper, if the author is dead, then you use past tense because you're talking about history. So we would not say, William Shakespeare writes Romeo and Juliet.
Has written.
Or just regular old past tense. William Shakespeare wrote Romeo and Juliet. Okay? So we don't talk about a dead author as though he is still living. Now there are some authors that you might write about that actually are still living. And if they are, you wouldn't want it to sound like in your introduction that they were dead. So who in here is reading Sarah Plain and Tall? Okay. Patricia McLaughlin, the author of Sarah Plain and Tall. I'm not sure if she's still alive. I can't remember. I know Pearl S. Buck, who wrote The Big Wave, is definitely not alive now. So if you talk about Pearl S. Buck and you're writing about the big wave, you'll say Pearl S. Buck wrote the big wave. Does it have a date in there?
It was 1985.
I can't remember. I read about her last year, but I can't remember if she's already died or not. But say the person who, Harry Potter, what's her name? She's definitely still alive. So if for some reason you were writing about Harry Potter, you would say, actually she wrote it in past tense. J.K. Rowling wrote Harry Potter in such and such a year. She lives in, I guess, London.
Yes. No.
You wouldn't say she lived in London if she's still living there, right? So talking about the author, if they're dead, you definitely use past tense. You talk about how they wrote the book because they aren't currently writing the book, obviously, if you're reading it. But if they're still living, then anything you talk about what what they're actually doing in their life, make it sound like they're still alive. Does that make sense? It does. Okay. Now, another thing that's really important is when we talk about the author. When we write about authors, the very first time we mention them, we use their full name. And ever after that in the paper, you only use their last name. You don't put titles like Mr., Mrs., Dr., His Royal Highness, or anything else. You just use their full name the first time and their last name the rest of the time. So, if I were writing about Romeo and Juliet, the first time I referred to the author in the introduction, I would put, that's right, William Shakespeare. Ever after that, in that same paper, anytime I mention him, I would say just Shakespeare. You only get to say their full name the first time, and that's the only time. What you never would do is call him Mr. Shakespeare, Dr. Shakespeare, because he wasn't one anyway, and you definitely wouldn't call him Will or William. I've had things like that before. No first name. You don't ever just call an author by their first name. Okay? Now, it's traditional to only use that full name the first time. I have seen kind of as an emphasis at the very end of the paper where somebody will put the whole name. But just want you to know that that's not conventional. The other thing about using their names is you can also substitute the word author. You don't have to say Shakespeare, 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 Shakespeare in every sentence. You can use terms like the author, the bard. That's one of William Shakespeare's. A bard is a play writer. So, all right, let's look at number 3, which is how to correctly title literature when you're writing about it. Turn to page 45. And here you'll find a handy chart that I found online. I redid it to suit me, but it's a really good chart. It's just generally not my work, but it was so handy that I decided to just update it for our use. Here are 2 rules about formatting titles. Short works and parts of long works are usually put in quotation marks. Long works and collections of short works, like a short story collection, are usually put in italics. So the one that really concerns us right now is number 1, which is fiction. A title of a short story, like we're going to be writing about this week, will always be put in quotation marks. Not italics, no underlines. Have y'all learned to underline titles? Anybody learned that you're supposed to underline book or story titles? Yeah. When I was growing up, that's all we could do because we were handwriting our papers. And then later we were typing our papers, but typewriters didn't have italics as an option. So we had to underline our titles. But now that there are italics on word processors, which is what everybody uses, underlines are out for titles. Unless you're having to write a test in class and you have to write a title and you underline it so you can show that it's a book title. Okay? Because, I mean, how would you write handwriting or italics or something? So, no underlining of titles. There's only one right way to do this. When we write about this short story this week, we're going to be using quotation marks around the story title. And the story title we're going to be doing is In Yet Obey. We're going to read that story in a few minutes. When we get to our book review, after the short story review, then we're going to be using a full book, and it'll be Sarah Plain and Tall or The Big Wave. Is everybody reading one or the other of those books at this point? Okay. You won't be able to do the assignment without reading it. So if you haven't got it, you need to go ahead and get it. Now, I am open to considering other books, but they have to be books that I know. So if you're reading a book that not just reading it, but that you're going to actually have finished and that you're going to know well enough to write about it, you can talk to me about it. And if it's a story title that I already know, then I will consider letting you do that. But I can't let you write about a story that I don't know because I wouldn't be able to help you with it. And then I wouldn't know whether you have done it right or not when you finish with it if I didn't know the story. One that I let a student do a couple of years ago, actually it's been probably 4 or 5 years ago, was The Witch of Blackbird Pond. I don't know if anybody's had to read that this year. Last year I had some students in my Georgia history class that read Sounder. Anybody read that? It's a really, really good book, but it's really sad. It's a sad dog story. So if you like sad dog stories, you'll love that book. I don't like sad dog stories, and I refuse to read them generally, but because it was set in Georgia, I decided to read it. And it's an excellent book. It's just so sad. Also, some other students read Turn Homeward, Hannah Lee. I don't know if any of y'all ever read that. That's a really good book. One of my favorites. I just found it last year. I know some people are reading The Hobbit. Are any of y'all reading The Hobbit? I've read it recently for a school or yard. If you wanted to write about The Hobbit, I could do that one. That's a story I know really well. And when I say a book, I won't know the book unless it's classic fiction. So, Hunger Games, no. Harry Potter, no. I read classic, so that's what I know about. So, if you've read any classic books that are generally read by students, there's a high probability that I will know the story. Just ask me about it. Okay. So that's how we're going to do our title for you won't actually be writing about the title right now, but you will be next week. This is a 4-week assignment we have coming up. This 2 weeks coming up, we'll be writing the middle part of it, just like we did when we did our research papers. We wrote the body, and then we went back later and wrote the introduction and conclusion. Remember when we did our reports? We'll be doing this one the same way. Okay, number 4 on page 43. Plot. I can't emphasize to you enough how important it is that before you try to write about a story, you have actually read the story. Because in order to write about a story well, you have to know it well and you have to understand it. Now, it never occurred to me ever in my life before until about 3 years ago that somebody would do what one person did, and that was they just totally made up events for the story review that we're getting ready to do. I was reading along, and the first paragraph was pretty good, and the second paragraph was pretty good, and then all of a sudden they just went off the rails and started writing about stuff that definitely was not in the story. And so when you are to write about literature, you can't do what I let you do on this last assignment, which is to make up your own stuff. You can't take the characters and setting and change them. You can't change anything that happens in the story when you write about a story. You have to actually write only about what's actually in the story. I know that probably makes sense to everybody, and I thought it probably did make sense to everybody, but apparently not to everybody. So the only way you can write knowledgeably about a story and not get a 0 is to actually have read the story and read it carefully, and then you'll be able to write about it well. Okay? Ditto for quotes. You don't make up quotes in a story. So if you're tempted to put words in the mouth of a character in your literature paper, which sometimes you're actually required to, I'm not requiring y'all to do that in this particular assignment, but sometimes you do have to do that. You have to get the exact quote out of the book. You can't sort of go, I think he said something like blah, 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 and then put down what you thought he said and put it in quotation marks. If you put quotation marks in it, it means this is exactly out of the book. And teachers that assign books for you to write about know those stories and most of everything that the characters say inside and out. So you have to be very careful that if you're going to quote somebody in a literature essay, that you quote them exactly. My 12th grade English teacher had us memorize a long quote from Macbeth, and we had to be able to say it and then write it with all the punctuation exactly on the test. So she had us practice it like this. Tomorrow, comma, and tomorrow, comma, and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. And we had to say the next punctuation. And so, because when she asked us to quote that on the test, she expected it to be quoted exactly right. Does that seem a little over the top? It did to me at the time, but that's the way it's done. That's a convention. All right. Now, look at number 6. This is really important. And we're going to see an example of this in the example essay, example book review that we're going to read. I should have taken it out, but it's just as well I left it in there because I can have y'all write a not sign over it. You don't ever refer to yourself when you're writing about literature. This is not a personal essay. Even though I will ask you in the conclusion to say what you thought about the story, you are not going to say, I thought, or I think this is such and such. You're going to say it just like it's a fact. Also, you don't refer to yourself as part of a group. You don't say, our story begins. Our hero was penniless. He's not our hero. And it's not, we do such and such. We don't talk about ourselves in literature. You say the story, the hero, keep yourself out of it. It doesn't belong in literature writing. Does that make sense? You also don't talk about your paper. You don't say, this story review is about blah, 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 blah. Or anything like that. When you're using numbers, you spell out any number that takes only 1 or 2 words, such as 38, 500, except for dates, addresses, times a day, or instances where numbers are normally used, like flight numbers and stuff like that. So when you write a date, if you want to write May 5th in formal writing, you write May 5th, 1988. You don't write May 5th, 1980. You get the picture. Dates, the convention is to use digits. Use digits. Okay? Same with times of day. Okay. Now that we've done that, what we're going to do is read our story that we're going to be writing about, and then we're going to talk about how to go about writing about it. Oh, one thing I didn't put on this list, but you're going to see, and we are going to talk about in just a minute, is that when you write about stories, you use literature vocabulary. So turn over to page 47. We want to intentionally use words like characters, setting, conflict, plot, and theme, and related words. That shows the instructor that, first of all, that you know what the story parts are. And it also is the kind of thing that people that read and write about stories would expect to find in a paper about a story. And it also increases your opportunity to be published in magnum opus, to use those literature words. So that's one thing we're going to definitely be doing. Let's read the story first, and then I'll show you an example, and then we can talk about our actual story. Turn to page 166. Now, anybody in here read a book or story by Jack London before? Call of the Wild, White Fang, you have? When Jack London was a young man, and I do have a little biography of him here in the handbook, he went to sea as a, first of all, he was an oyster pirate, which in San Francisco Bay, which meant not that he boarded ships and took things he wasn't supposed to, but he actually had his own boat as a young teenager. I think he got it maybe when he was 13, and he was out in San Francisco Bay collecting oysters. So he was a very hardy, hard-working, adventurous fellow right from the start. And then when he was 16, he actually went to sea on a sailing schooner and Sutherland, and actually spent a year over in Japan and around in that area collecting skins, I think is what he was doing. So he was very adventurous, and so when he came back and started writing, most of his stories that he wrote were adventure stories. And this is one of them, one of his early stories. His later stories, like Call of the Wild, White Fang, and other stories that he wrote, he later became a very committed evolutionist, and you see that reflected in his stories later when he's grown up. Survival of the fittest and all that kind of stuff. But as a young man, he just wrote adventure stories that were based on some of the things that he had experienced. So let's read In Yedo Bay. And I want you to be listening in here. Try to pinpoint what you think the problem is, the conflict, where you think the climax of the story is. Notice who the characters are. See if you can figure out what the setting is, maybe what the time period is. And also, Jack London seems to have had an affection for a particular style technique that we use in IEW. So I want you to see if any of those jump out at you as we're reading. Somewhere along Theater Street, he had lost it. He remembered being hustled somewhat roughly on the bridge over one of the canals that crossed that busy thoroughfare. Probably some light-fingered pickpocket was even then enjoying the 50-odd yen his purse had contained. And then again, he thought he might have lost it himself, just lost it carelessly. Hopelessly, and for the 20th time, he searched in all his pockets for the missing purse. It was not there. His hand lingered in his empty hip pocket, and he woefully regarded the voluble and vociferous restaurant keeper, who insanely clamored, 25 cents! You pay now! 25 cents! But my purse, the boy said. I tell you I've lost it somewhere. Whereupon the restaurant keeper lifted his arms indignantly and shrieked, 25 cents! 25 cents! You pay now! Quite a crowd had collected, and it was growing embarrassing for Alf Davis. It was so ridiculous and petty, Alf thought, such a disturbance about nothing. And decidedly, he must be doing something. Thoughts of diving wildly through that forest of legs and of striking out at whomsoever opposed him flashed through his mind. But, as though divining his purpose, One of the waiters, a short and chunky chap with an evil-looking cast in one eye, seized him by the arm. "You pay now! You pay now! 25 cents!" yelled the proprietor, hoarse with rage. Alf was red in the face, too, from mortification, but he resolutely set out on another exploration. He had given up the purse, pinning his last hope on stray coins. In the little change pocket of his coat, he found a 10-cent piece and a 5 copper cent. And remembering having recently missed a 10-cent piece, he cut the seam of the pocket and resurrected the coin from the depths of the lining. 25 cents he held in his hand, the sum required to pay for the supper he had eaten. He turned them over to the proprietor, who counted them, grew suddenly calm, and bowed obsequiously. In fact, the whole crowd bowed obsequiously and melted away. Alf Davis was a young sailor, just turned 16, on board the Annie Mine, an American sailing schooner, which had run into Yokohama to ship its season's catch of skins to London. And in this, his second trip ashore, he was beginning to snatch his first puzzling glimpses of the Japanese mind. He laughed when the bowing and kowtowing was over, and turned on his heel to confront another problem. How was he to get aboard ship? It was 11 o'clock at night, and there would be no ship's boats ashore, while the outlook for hiring a native boatman, with nothing but empty pockets to draw upon, was not particularly inviting. Keeping a sharp lookout for shipmates, he went down to the pier. At Yokohama, there are no long lines of wharves. The shipping lies out at anchor, enabling a few hundred of the short-legged people to make a livelihood by carrying passengers to and from the shore. A dozen sampan men and boys hailed Alf and offered their services. He selected the most favorable-looking one, an old and beneficent-appearing man with a withered leg. Alf stepped into his sampan and sat down. It was quite dark, and he could not see what the old fellow was doing, though he evidently was doing nothing about shoving off and getting underway. At last, he limped over and peered into Alf's face. 10 cents, he said. Yes, I know, 10 cents, Alf answered carelessly. But hurry up. American schooner. 10 cents, you pay now, the old fellow insisted. Alf felt himself growing hot all over the hateful words, pay now. You take me to American schooner, then I pay, he said. But the man stood up patiently before him, held out his hand, and said, 10 cents, you pay now. Alf tried to explain. He had no money. He had lost his purse, but he would pay. As soon as he got aboard the American schooner, he would pay. No, he would not even go aboard the American schooner. He would call out to his shipmates, and they would give the sampan man the 10-cent purse. After that, he would go aboard. So it was all right, of course. To all of which the beneficent-appearing old man replied, You pay now, 10 cents, and to make matters worse, the other sampan men squatted on the pier steps, listening. Alf, chagrined and angry, stood up to step ashore. But the old fellow laid a detaining hand on his sleeve. You give shirt now. I take you American schooner, he proposed. Then it was that all of Alf's American independence flamed up in his breast. The American has a born dislike of being imposed upon, and to Alf this was sheer robbery. 10 cents was equivalent to 6 American cents, while his shirt, which was of good quality and was new, had cost him $2. He turned his back on the man without a word and went out to the end of the pier, the crowd laughing with great gusto, following at his heels. The majority of them were heavy-set, muscular fellows, and the July night being one of sweltering heat, they were clad in the least possible raiment. The water people of any race are rough and turbulent, and it struck Alf that to be out at midnight on a pier end with such a crowd of wharfmen in a big Japanese city was not as safe as it might be. One burly fellow with a shock of black hair and ferocious eyes came up. The rest shoved in after him to take part in the discussion. Give me shoes, the man said. Give me shoes now. I take you American schooner. Alf shook his head, whereat the crowd clamored that he accept the proposal. Now the American is so constituted that to browbeat or bully him is the last way under the sun of getting him to do any certain thing. He will dare willingly, but he will not permit himself to be driven. So this attempt of the boatman to force Alf only aroused all the dogged stubbornness of his race. The same qualities were in him that are in men who lead forlorn hopes. And there, under the stars, on the lonely pier, encircled by the jostling and shouldering gang, he resolved that he would die rather than submit to the indignity of being robbed of a single stitch of clothing. Not Value, but principle was at stake. Then somebody thrust roughly against him from behind. He whirled about with flashing eyes, and the crowd grew involuntarily. The circle involuntarily gave ground. But the crowd was growing more boisterous. Each and every article of clothing he had on was demanded by one or another, and these demands were shouted simultaneously at the tops of very healthy lungs. Alf had long since ceased to say anything, but he knew that the situation was getting dangerous, and that the only thing left to him was to get away. His face was set doggedly, his eyes glinted like points of steel, and his body was firmly and confidently poised. This air of determination sufficiently impressed the boatmen to make them give way before him when he started to walk toward the shore end of the pier. But they trooped along beside him and behind him, shouting and laughing more noisily than ever. One of the youngsters, about Alf's size and build, impudently snatched his cap from his head, but before he could put it on his own head, Alf struck out from the shoulder and sent the fellow rolling on the stones. The cap flew out of his hand and disappeared among the many legs. Alf did some quick thinking. His sailor pride would not permit him to leave the cap in their hands. He followed in the direction it had sped and soon found it under the bare foot of a stalwart fellow, who kept his weight stolidly upon it. Alf tried to get the cap out by a sudden jerk, but failed. He shoved against the man's leg, but the man only grunted. It was challenge direct, and Alf accepted it. Like a flash, one leg was behind the man, and Alf had thrust strongly with his shoulder against the fellow's chest. Nothing could save the man from the fierce vigorousness of the trick, and he was hurled over and backward. Next, the cap was on Alf's head, and his fists were up before him. Then he whirled about to prevent attack from behind, and all those in that quarter fled precipitately. This was what he had wanted. None remained between him and the shore end. The pier was narrow. Facing them and threatening them with his fist, those who attempted to pass him on either side, he continued his retreat. It was exciting work, walking backward and at the same time checking that surging mass of men. Where the pier joins the shore was the station of the harbor police, and Alf backed into the electric lighted office, very much to the amusement of the dapper lieutenant in charge. The sampan men, grown quiet and orderly, clustered like flies by the open door, through which they could see and hear what passed. Alf explained his difficulty in few words and demanded as the privilege of a stranger in a strange land that the lieutenant put him aboard in the police boat. The lieutenant, in turn, who knew all the rules and regulations by heart, explained that the harbor police were not ferrymen, and that the police boats had other functions to perform than that of transporting belated and penniless sailormen to their ships. He also said that he knew the sampan men to be natural-born robbers, but that so long as they robbed within the law, he was powerless. It was their right to collect fares in advance, and who was he to command them to take a passenger and collect fare at the journey's end? Alf acknowledged the justice of his remarks, but suggested that while he could not command, he might persuade. The lieutenant was willing to oblige, and went to the door, from where he delivered a speech to the crowd. But they, too, knew their rights, and when the officer had finished, shouted in chorus their abominable, 10 sen! You pay now! You pay now! You see, I can do nothing, said the lieutenant, who, by the way, spoke perfect English. But I have warned them not to harm or molest you, so you will be safe at least. The night is warm and half over. Lie down somewhere and go to sleep. I would permit you to sleep here in the office, were it not against the rules and regulations. Alf thanked him for his kindness and courtesy, but the sampan men had aroused all his pride and doggedness, and the problem could not be solved that way. To sleep out the night on the stones was an acknowledgment of defeat. The sampan men refuse to take me out? The lieutenant nodded. And you refuse to take me out? Again, the lieutenant nodded. Well then, it's not in the rules and regulations that you can prevent my taking myself out. The lieutenant was perplexed. There is no boat, he said. That's not the question, Alf exclaimed hotly. If I take myself out, everybody's satisfied, and no harm done. Yes, what you say is true, persisted the puzzled lieutenant, but you cannot take yourself out. You just watch me, was the retort. Down went Alf's cap on the office floor. Right and left he kicked off his low-cut shoes. Trousers and shirt followed. Remember, he said in ringing tones, I, as a citizen of the United States, shall hold you, the city of Yokohama, and the government of Japan responsible for those clothes. Good night. He plunged through the doorway, scattering the astounded boatmen to either side, and ran out on the pier. But they quickly recovered and ran after him, shouting with glee at the new phase the situation had taken. It was a night long remembered among the waterfolk of Yokohama town. Straight to the end, Alf ran, and without a pause, dived off cleanly and neatly into the water. He struck out with a lusty single overhand stroke, till curiosity prompted him to halt for a moment. Out of the darkness, from where the pier should be, voices were calling to him. He turned on his back, floated, and listened. All right, he could distinguish from the babble. No pay now. Pay by and by. Come back now. Pay by and by. No, thank you, he called back. No pay at all. Good night. Then he faced about in order to locate the Annie Mine. She was fully a mile away, and in the darkness it was no easy task to get her bearings. First, he settled upon a blaze of lights which he knew nothing but a man of war could make. That must be the United States warship Lancaster. Somewhere to the left and beyond should be the Annie Mine. But to the left, he made out 3 lights close together. That could not be the schooner. For the moment, he was confused. He rolled over on his back and shut his eyes, striving to construct a mental picture of the harbor as he had seen it in daytime. With a snort of satisfaction, he rolled back again. The 3 lights evidently belonged to the big English tramp steamer. Therefore, the schooner must lie somewhere between the 3 lights and the Lancaster. He gazed long and steadily, and there, very dim and low, but at the point he expected, burned a single light, the anchor light of the Annie Mine. And it was a fine swim under the starshine. The air was as warm as the water, and the water as warm as tepid milk. The good salt taste of it was in his mouth, the tingling of it along his limbs, and the steady beat of his heart, heavy and strong, made him glad for living. But beyond being glorious, the swim was uneventful. On the right hand, he passed the many-lighted Lancaster, on the left hand, the English tramp, and ere long, the Annie Mine loomed above him. He grasped the hanging rope ladder and drew himself noiselessly on deck. There was no one in sight. He saw a light in the galley and knew that the captain's son, who kept the lonely anchor watch, was making coffee. Alf went forward to the forecastle. The men were snoring in their bunks, and in that confined space, the heat seemed to him insufferable. So he put on a thin cotton shirt and a pair of dungaree trousers, tucked blanket and pillow under his arm, and went up on the deck and out on the forecastle head. Hardly had he begun to doze when he was roused by a boat coming alongside and hailing the anchor watch. It was the police boat, and to Alf it was given to enjoy the excited conversation that ensued. Yes, the captain's son recognized the clothes. They belonged to Alf Davis, one of the seamen. What had happened? No, Alf Davis had not come aboard. He was ashore. He was not ashore? Then he must be drowned. Here both the lieutenant and the captain's son talked at the same time, and Alf could make out nothing. Then he heard them come forward and rouse out the crew. The crew grumbled sleepily and said that Alf Davis was not in the forecastle, whereupon the captain's son waxed indignant at the Yokohama police and their ways, and the lieutenant quoted rules and regulations in despairing accents. Alf rose up from the forecastle head and extended his hand, saying, I guess I'll take those clothes. Thank you for bringing them aboard so promptly. I don't see why you couldn't have brought you aboard inside of them, said the captain's son. And the police lieutenant said nothing, though he turned the clothes over somewhat sheepishly to their rightful owner. The next day, when Alf started to go ashore, he found himself surrounded by shouting and gesticulating, though very respectful, sampan men, all extraordinarily anxious to have him for a passenger. Nor did the one he selected say, You pay now, when he entered his boat. When Alf was prepared to step out on the pier, he offered the man the customary 10 cents. But the man drew himself up and shook his head. You all right, he said. You no pay. You never no pay. You bully boy and all right. And for the rest of the Annie Mine stay in the port, the sampan men refused money at Alf Davis's hand. Out of admiration for his pluck and independence, they had given him the freedom of the harbor. The end. Okay, let's talk about the story. First of all, did anybody notice the style thing that I mentioned that was very common throughout the story? I'll give you a hint. It was a dress-up.
There were around.
Yes. Almost every sentence. If you look back at the story, sometimes he uses 2 or 3 in one sentence. Not every sentence, but very, very frequently. So he's definitely using it more than once per paragraph. One of them I noticed had it in there 3 times in one sentence. Good job. That's great. I wish I could find that sentence again. I should have underlined it. Okay, so let's talk about the story structure. I've got a chart in here that has everything on it, but I don't want you to look at it yet. I want to see what you know without looking at the chart first. First of all, where's the story set?
Japan.
Ta-da! Where in Japan? Yokohama. And as I put on the story chart, I looked that up on the computer, and it's about 17 miles from Tokyo. So it's a real place. Obviously, it's on the coast. All right. What do you think about the time period of the story? Were there any clues that helped you know what the time period was? Huh?
First.
Oh, yes. And what do you think that word purse meant? Okay, that's one clue.
He talks about clothes being $2.
There you go. A shirt of good quality costs $2 whole. Right. So Jack London was living during the early 1900s, and he's probably writing about the time period that he was living in. So, good catch. That's great. What time of year is it? Exactly. You know, it's really it snows in Japan and everything. So obviously this was not a winter story. He's swimming. The water's warm. Okay, great. Let's see if there's anything else about the setting on this one y'all notice. That's pretty much it. All right. What about the characters? First of all, who is the protagonist? Before you tell me that, what is a protagonist? Protagonist is the main character. Sometimes we think of the protagonist as the hero of the story, but that's right, because sometimes the main character isn't very heroic, right? And the protagonist isn't necessarily even a good guy. So who is the protagonist in this story?
Alf Davis.
Right. How old is he?
13.
16. The girls have it. How would you describe Alf Davis? Give me some personality characteristics.
He's mean.
He's mean? What did he do that made you think that he was mean?
He wouldn't pay anything.
He's unresponsible.
Right. He just,
Irresponsible.
he was kind of tried to out-talk the boat owner, right? You say he's irresponsible. Why do you say that?
Because he lost his
Lost my purse. Yes. I think probably after this, he probably learns to be more careful, right?
He's proud.
Definitely. That may be his most shining quality. He's definitely proud. In fact, it would be interesting, and I don't think I've ever done this, to go through and circle that word proud and see how many times it actually appears in the story.
There are also a lot of synonyms of proud.
Yes, you're right. Okay, so he's proud. It seems that some of the things that he does or doesn't do is strictly because it's a pride issue with him. For instance, he won't just sleep out the night outside of the police station because he's too proud. That would mean that they won, right? Okay, what other qualities would you attribute to Alf Davis? Let's see, so far we have a lot of really negative qualities. Are there any positive qualities? Kind of smart? In what way?
Like, kind of like outsmart a little bit. Like we got in the ocean in the boat and worked out.
He's a problem solver, right? He's resourceful. I don't know that he's actually wise, but he did come up with a solution to his problem. I mean, as a mother, thinking of a 16-year-old kid of mine running down a pier and jumping into a dark bay, it's a long way to swim a mile. Who in here swims? Okay. Swimming a mile this far. I had a friend when I was in my young adult days. We all went to the same church. Who I can't remember what school this happened at, but is there a lake at Clemson?
Yes.
Is there a little lake?
We're
Okay.
right behind the football stadium.
All right. I think this person was at Clemson. I can't. And it was a really nice warm spring day. It was one of the first really warm days, and he was studying by the lake, and he decided that he would just go for a swim, and he would swim across the lake, and so he jumped in and started swimming across, and I guess a little more than halfway across, he started to get really, really tired, and he swam and he swam and he swam until he was totally exhausted, and then he just thought, I'm just going to drown because I can't go any further, and he just, at that point, his legs were just kind of limp, and he just kind of sank down in the water, and it was about this deep. His knees touched the bottom, and he just drug himself. He said it really didn't look that far from the shore across. So, thinking about this kid leaping into water at night and swimming a mile, not even really exactly sure where he's going until he's already in the water, that to me is totally foolhardy.
He didn't have common sense.
Yeah, he didn't seem to have any common sense,
He
did
was
he?
also determined.
He was very determined, and he was what you would call impulsive. Have y'all ever heard that word?
Yeah.
That means acting before thinking. I think Alf Davis did that. So it worked out for him, though. And this is sort of skipping ahead in the story, but, well, I won't ask you that yet. I'll ask you that in a few minutes. Okay, who else is in the story? So he does have some good qualities. He's pretty brash, though, and prideful. And I'm not sure that he actually overcomes those particular qualities in the story. I think he's probably encouraged to continue to behave that way by the outcome. Okay, who else is in the story? He's the protagonist. What is the problem of the story? What's the conflict?
If he lost his money, so
He did lose his money, so
he can't get back to the
can't get back to the ship. Is that what you were going to say, Matthew? Will Alf be able to get back to the ship? All right. Who's preventing him from possibly being able to get back to the ship?
Sampan Man.
All of Japan.
All of Japan. Okay, so the Sampan Man. Now, they're kind of odd antagonists because they're not really, I mean, are they villains? No, they're just businessmen. Isn't their right to collect their fare in advance? Absolutely. They don't
They
have
just
to.
talk weird.
Well, they know probably enough English to communicate with their passengers, and being Japan, they would have had passengers from all over the world, so obviously they can't learn everybody's language, right? So, they're not villains, they're just, they want the money. They want the
Regular
money.
people.
It's reasonable. So they may be what prevents Alf from getting back. So what do we call that kind of a conflict? We have 5 choices. We have man versus man versus society, man versus himself, man versus nature or animal, man versus God or fate. I think we can have 2. There's one main one, but then there's also another one.
versus society.
Yes. It's a whole group of Sampan men. It's really not just one, so we can call that man versus society, all of Japan. What might the other one be? Once he decides to jump in the water and swim, there might be something that actually hinders him from getting back. That's right. Y'all hear that? Man against nature. Did anybody expect? No.
He's gonna get eaten
That
by
would have been a
sharks.
lot more exciting if we could have had a little more of a tense climax, couldn't we? Right? Okay, so we know what the conflict is. We know what Alf Davis tries to do. First, he tries. What kind of actions does he take to try to get back to the ship? He takes quite a few before he takes that final action. What's the first thing he tries to do?
He tried to change the money.
He tried to change their minds about taking him, right? First, he tries to bluff them. He goes, yes, I know, 10 cents, but take me to the schooner. He tries the kind of bluffing kind of thing, right? And that doesn't work. So then he gets out of the boat. And then what does he have to do? Right. Yes, he ignores them, but he also has to, he was kind of enjoying, I think, fighting those guys. As he said, it was exciting work going down here. I mean, as a mother, can't bear the thought. And then he gets to the police office, and what does he try to do there?
He gets his clothes back.
Well, he does eventually, but what does he do first to see if he can he's still trying to get back to the ship. What does he try to do at the police office?
Get the police ticket.
Right. He demands, as a stranger in a strange land, that he be taken to a ship. Now, I like the police lieutenant. What's the word dapper mean? Anybody know that word? The dapper police lieutenant. Well, it sort of has a little bit of that idea in there. But even if you aren't handsome, you can still be dapper by being very neat and polite and conducting yourself with dignity. All of that is kind of in the idea of being dapper. So, is the police lieutenant a bad guy? No. He just is very compulsive about carrying out what? The rules and regulations. He knows them by the book, right? So he says he can't take him. That's not his job. And so Alf tries to get him to convince the sampan man. Do they go for that? No. Then the lieutenant offers him another option, which is just to sleep there, right? And no. So as a last resort, Alf kicks off all his clothes, goes running down the pier, and what do the sampan men think about this?
I think they freak out a little bit.
Yeah.
Once he's in the water, they hear him yelling back.
Yeah, they go running after him, laughing and stuff. They thought that was hilarious, apparently, that he would actually do something like that. They can't believe it. At that point, they're thinking, this guy is crazy. They want to see what he's going to do, so they go running after him. And once they realize that he just isn't going to be a customer, then they all try to get him as a customer. So, come back! We'll take you to the boat, the ship. Nope, no thanks. Oh, by the way, I've actually looked up, you should do this too. I should get a picture and put it in my handbook. I have room for it right there at the bottom of the story. A sampan boat is an actual kind of little low, shallow boat, pointed, I think it was pointed on both ends, that they actually do still have in Japan. So look that up on the computer. It's interesting to see. Yeah, kind of like a canoe. Okay, so the climax comes, where's the climax? The problem is he going to be able to get back to the ship? So the climax is right before the problem is solved. So what do you think the climax is of the story? I think so. I think it's when he starts pulling his clothes off and kicking his shoes off and running down the pier. Because at that point, something's gonna happen. He's either gonna get back to the ship, or he's gonna drown, or he's gonna be eaten by something, or partially eaten by something. So that's the climax of the story. And that would go at the beginning of which paragraph? Body paragraph 3. Climax goes at the beginning of body paragraph 3. So at that point, we really don't know, but as soon as we read that sentence that says, and it was a fine swim under the starshine, that's exactly what it is that it says. But beyond being glorious, the swim was uneventful. That's when we go, no Jaws. So the climax of the story, then he gets back on the boat. It's too hot. He goes to sleep on the deck. This is the denouement. This is the tying up of all the loose ends. And so the dapper lieutenant comes aboard, and they have that little interchange. And I can just see Alf. He's lying there on the deck with his hand behind his head. I mean, if I were the lieutenant, I might have just wanted to punch him for being so cocky. I'll take those clothes. Thank you for bringing them aboard so promptly. Okay. And then the conclusion of the story, what happens as a result of all that? How do the sampan men treat him after that?
They don't make him pay to get on the boat.
I love that line. You no pay. You never no pay. You bully boy, and you all right.
They call him a boy.
Yes, that's a different that's a different meaning of bully. A bully boy meant somebody who's strong, not scared, resourceful. So that word bully doesn't mean the same thing as what we think of when we use the word bully. That's a very good observation. So let's see. What do you think the theme of the story is? I'm going to let y'all look at the chart here in a minute, and the chart's going to be there for you to use when you do your homework. Don't look at the theme. No cheating.
No, I was just like looking.
Oh, just to see. Okay. All right. So let's see. Let's see what we could possibly pick as a thing. Turn back with me to page 39. Remember, themes of stories can be stated just with a couple of words or maybe one word, and they can also be stated as full sentences. So let's just look for some words that we think maybe could be a theme for this story. I'll just let y'all look at it quietly for just a minute. Okay, do any of y'all think you picked out some that probably would work as a theme for the story? Okay, let's see some hands.
Ambition or compromise.
Okay, I had never thought about compromise before, but he was wanting the sampan men to compromise with him, wasn't he? Taylor?
Survival and resourcefulness.
Yes, absolutely. I agree. Okay, see.
Pride and humility one.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, any others? I do think he's an ambitious person. I never really thought about that before, but I think probably growing up, coming of age is probably our theme too in the story. Now, here's the question. What lesson did Alf learn from this little episode?
Don't lose stuff.
Okay, you did learn not to lose stuff. What else did he learn?
Don't lose your purse.
Yep. What else? Do you think that he learned that, do you think he learned to be less prideful? I think his pride probably grew as a result of this.
You
think
learn pride is the best way.
I think he probably was encouraged to believe that he could always work it out.
If you like kept being stubborn, he could get his way.
Yeah, and is that necessarily a good lesson that he learned?
No.
Because sooner or later, he's going to run into a situation where that's not going to work, right? But for now, the lesson he learned was to just kind of keep
Rely on yourself.
right. So, y'all did really well with that. So let's look at the story chart because I want you to be able to use it for your homework. If you look on page 170, there is something that I need to write. I need to put in here next time I reprint my handbooks. So I'm going to have y'all write it on yours. And that is body paragraphs. Okay, you see where it says plot stage 1? We have all of our ovals here. Okay, right next to the ovals, I want you to write which body paragraph everything goes in. Okay, so plot stage 1, right next to it, write body paragraph 1, right next to the first oval. And then the conflict and rising action is going to be body paragraph 2 when you write about it. And then all 3 of these will show up in body paragraph 3. Body paragraph 3, body paragraph 3, and body paragraph 3. Okay. So in your first paragraph, you're going to talk about the exposition. I don't want to see my words in your exposition, okay? I want you to write your own paragraph. Same with body paragraph 2. That will be the conflict and the rising action, all the things that Alpha tries to do to solve this problem. And then in body paragraph 3, we'll have the climax where he goes running down the pier. The police lieutenant comes aboard, the sampan men celebrate him as a hero, and that sort of thing. Now let's talk about what's different again about writing about these things. When you write about it, you're going to use literature vocabulary, and you're going to use present tense. So I want you to see an example of a paper where somebody did that. Who in here has actually read Bridge to Terabithia? Has anybody in here? You read it? Okay. All right. Well, this particular paper was not a student of mine, but it's a good example of this kind of paper. So let's look at it. Page 137. Now, the part you're going to be writing this particular 2 weeks is the middle part. So I want you to pick up your writing implement, and I want you to draw a bracket here for these 3 paragraphs. This is the part you're going to be writing for your homework. Now, see? The 3 middle paragraphs is what you're going to be doing for your homework. So we're not even going to read the introduction and conclusion right now. We're just going to read the 3 middle paragraphs. And I want you to notice the black bold print. Those are literature words off of the list that I just showed you. And on your homework assignment sheet, it will refer you to that page, and it says on your homework assignment page, I think it says something like you have to use at least 3 literature words, 3 to 5 literature words in bold. Let me tell you another little point about the assignment you're getting ready to work on. When you come back, you will be bringing your paper back, the 3 middle paragraphs, and you will be trading papers with a classmate who is not one of your best friends. And this is what we call peer editing. So you will be reading each other's papers, and you will be using a form exactly like I have on page 207, and you will be looking for all of this stuff that is required on your checklist. And that way, then you will conference with your classmate, and you will show them, you'll be putting at least one smiley face on their paper somewhere, something that you liked, like I always do with y'all's papers. And then you'll be checking things off on the checklist, and you'll show them if they're missing some literature words, or if they had things in the wrong paragraph, or if they accidentally slipped into past tense, or something like that. So I would suggest that you don't put off working on your assignment this time. You get right to work on it so that you can do your very best, since you'll be having to trade papers with somebody. Okay? It's an encouragement. The other reason that I have people do this is because sometimes in college classes you'll have to do this. So, yeah.
I don't want to go to college.
Peer editing. So I'm giving you this experience early so you won't be so horrified when it happens. And also, I want you to see how much easier it is to find other people's mistakes than it is to find your own mistakes. It is so much easier. Other people's mistakes tend to jump out at you, whereas when you read your own papers, you know what you meant to say, and you're kind of filling in the blanks as you're reading your own work. Does anybody know that experience? Sometimes I'll leave a word out, and I won't notice it because my mind is filling in the missing words. Also, I want you to feel sorry for me. This will make you so much better students because you'll go, poor Mrs. Kimbrell, she has to go through and count all of this stuff. I'll never forget to bold my blah, blah, blah again. That's kind of a joke, but not completely. All right, let's look at page 137. We're just going to read through these 3 paragraphs, and I think we've got enough time to finish. I want you to pay particular attention to the bolded literature words, and these are the kinds of things that I want to see in your work. You don't have to use these exact ones. You can use anything off of those lists for the particular paragraphs. As the story opens, literature words, the reader meets one of the main characters. Notice she didn't say, we meet one of the main characters. The correct literary way to say it is the reader. Jesse Aaron's a 5th grade boy and his 4 sisters. Jesse, nicknamed Jess, loves and enjoys drawing, but is not encouraged by his parents, by his teachers, or by his prissy older sisters. I love that. When Jess arrives at school on the first day of the 5th grade, a new girl named Leslie Burke, another key character, catches his attention when she outruns even the fastest boys in a race. Can that girl run? Exclaims Jesse when he watches her. Befriending each other almost immediately, Jess discovers that Leslie has a wonderful imagination, and together they create a magical world they call Terabithia. Likely they play king and queen, rule Terabithia, and crown a puppy that Jess gives to Leslie for Christmas as prince. Okay, there's the exposition. The conflict is introduced, and I do want you to definitely use characters, conflict, all those plot stages, okay, and literature elements. The conflict is introduced when the other students at school notice that Jess and Leslie are friends. They tease the two mercilessly. There should be a period after friends. There should be a whole new sentence. The characters react to the conflict by trying desperately to ignore the criticisms, but the pressure makes them hesitant to become better friends. In order to find peace, they spend more time in Terabithia, talk often about their situation, and become truly intimate friends. When Jess's loving and supportive music teacher, whom he trusts, talks with him during lunch one day, Jess is much relieved. But then something horrible happens. A tragic sequence of events ensues. How will Jess be able to cope? While Jess had been with his music teacher, it should have the word, okay, it does later on. While Jess had been with his music teacher, Leslie had gone to Terabithia expecting Jess to be there. The old and tattered rope they had used to swing over the creek was broken while Leslie was gliding over. She fell into the creek, she hit her head, she died alone. I really think this should actually be in body paragraph 2, but for many days Jess is despondent. Maybe that should be the beginning of paragraph 3. For many days Jess is despondent, trying to reconcile with Leslie's death. Jess goes to Terabithia often, but finds it is terribly unreal without Leslie's deft imagination. Gradually, Jess begins to remember how Leslie had used vocabulary from myths she had read to make Terabithia regal, magical, and almost supernatural. The story reaches the climax. He recalls some familiar words, then builds a bridge over the creek and goes home to get his younger sister Maybelle. Using his newfound imagination and words, he makes her the new queen and realizes how much stronger Leslie has made him. The closing scene shows how much the main character has changed. Okay, so using the format that I gave you on the chart, you're going to fill out your keyword outline. Don't skip the keyword outline. Use the story chart, fill out your keyword outline so that you're not sitting there writing with the story chart in front of you and being poisoned by my words that are on the story chart. Okay? And then you're going to write your 3 body paragraphs. Go back and put in your literature work. Go back and put in all your style stuff. Do a really good job so that you won't dread your classmate looking at it, okay? Any questions? Oh, let me give y'all one key word of advice here. Y'all look at me. This is really different from anything we've done before. Besides just the whole abstract story structure thing, it's got literature vocabulary, and it's got writing in present tense. It's kind of hard. So if you have trouble with it and you have questions, what should you do? Right. Contact me. I do not want you, and I especially don't want your editor suffering. Okay? Email me or call me. If it's really complicated, give me a call. Or if it looks too complicated to deal with in an email, then I can call you back or something, okay? But I want to make sure that you know what to do, because once you learn how to do this well, you will be in such good shape for writing high school literature classes or college classes. This is the beginning of stuff to build on, okay? It's really super duper extra important.